Video I'll be talking about the arterial supply to the brain. So this is the heart, this is the ascending aorta, and this is the arch of aorta. So the arch of aorta gives three branches. First is the brachiocephalic trunk, second is the common carotid, the left common carotid, and third is the left subclavian. Now the brachiocephalic trunk uh, goes to the right side and it divides into right common carotid, this branch over here, and right subclavian. This was the left common carotid and this was the left subclavian. So the subclavian artery gives off a branch which is known as vertebral artery. So this is the right vertebral artery and this here is the left vertebral artery. Now the vertebral artery, this branch over here is the vertebral artery. It ascends through the transverse foramina of vertebra C6, C5 to up to C1, and then it makes its way into the brain. The point to be noted is that it doesn't travel through the transverse process of C7 vertebra. Now after once it reaches the brain, the right sided and the left sided vertebral arteries unite to form the basilar artery. So this here is the basilar artery, and these were the right sided this was the right sided basilar vertebral artery, and this is the left sided vertebral artery. Now the vertebral artery gives some branches. So this here is the spinal cord. So the spinal it gives two branches to the spinal cord. First is the anterior spinal artery, which is present anteriorly to the spinal cord, and the second is the posterior spinal artery, which is present posteriorly to the spinal cord. Then it also gives other branches such as the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So we will see that this branch over here is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and we can see it's arising posteriorly, that is posterior to the medulla, and it's traveling inferior to the cerebellum and supplying the cerebellum. So hence it justifies the name of posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So these are the three branches: anterior spinal, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and it also gives one meningeal branch and a medullary branch. Now comes the basilar artery. So this here is the basilar artery. Now the basilar artery gives pontine branches. So this over here is the pons. So it is we can clearly see it is giving off branches to pons, which are the pontine arteries on the either side. Now it also gives two other branches. One is this one. Uh, one is this branch, which is traveling uh, over the top of the cerebellum. So this is known as superior cerebellar artery. So this here is superior cerebellar artery. We also saw one artery which is traveling beneath the cerebellum and posteriorly, which was posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which was a branch of vertebral artery, and now this over here is the superior cerebellar artery. Now we can also see another branch, this one, which is the posterior cerebral artery. So we can see it's traveling posterior to the cerebrum, so hence the name posterior cerebral artery. And we can see that this structure over here is the pons, and a nerve arises between these posterior cerebral and superior cerebellar artery, and these are cranial nerve 3 and 4. So in this model I have removed the cranial nerve 3 and 4, but if they were present we could see them traveling between the superior cerebellar artery and the posterior cerebral artery, and hence if there is any aneurysm in the posterior cerebral artery, it can compress onto cranial nerve 3. So we saw the pontine branches, then we saw the superior cerebellar branch, then we saw the posterior cerebral branch, and there's one more branch which is which goes by the name of anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So we can see this branch over here, which is traveling anteriorly to the cerebellum. So this here is the cerebellum, and we can see one branch which is anterior to the cerebellum and on the inferior aspect, hence the name anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And there's one more branch which goes by the name of labyrinthine artery. So in this model, it has been shown to be arising from the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, but it can also arise directly from the basilar artery. So it can be directly a branch of basilar artery as well. So these are the 5 branches of the basilar artery. So again reiterating what are these 5 branches. So first is the superior cerebellar artery. So this here is the superior cerebellar artery, and one is the posterior cerebral artery. So this over here is the posterior cerebral artery traveling posterior to the cerebrum, and the others are the pontine branches. So these here are the pontine branches. One is this branch traveling anterior to the cerebellum and on the inferior aspect. So this is anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the other is the labyrinthine artery. Now we will see the internal carotid artery. So this was the brachiocephalic trunk, and here is the and here arising is the common carotid artery, and on the other side also we can see that this is the common carotid. So the common carotid divides into an internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery, it ascends upwards. So we can see it is ascending upwards, and after making its way into the brain, it gives off these branches. So this here is the internal carotid artery. So we can see a branch that is traveling anteriorly. So these two branches are the anterior cerebral arteries. So this is the frontal lobe. So this here is the frontal lobe, and the anterior cerebral artery supplies the anterior part of the cerebrum. So these here are the anterior cerebral artery. Then we will also be able to make out another branch uh, going off laterally from the internal carotid system. So this was the carotid artery, these were the anterior cerebral artery, and we can see one artery going laterally. So this here we can see one artery which is going laterally and lying inside this sylvian fissure and giving off branches on the lateral surface of the brain. So this here is the middle cerebral artery. So this here is the middle cerebral artery. I'll rotate this model so you can clearly see that. So this was the internal carotid system, these were the anterior cerebral arteries, and these are the middle cerebral arteries. Now we can also see one branch which is traveling anteriorly. So this branch over here, which is traveling anteriorly from the internal carotid artery, is the ophthalmic artery. It passes into the orbit and supplies the eye. So this here is the optic artery. Now it also gives off posterior communicating artery. So we can see one artery which is arising from the internal carotid, and it is going posteriorly and joining to the this artery, which is the posterior cerebral artery. So this is known as posterior communicating artery, and it is connecting the anterior circulation formed by the internal carotid arteries to the posterior circulation formed by the vertebral arteries. So this here is the posterior communicating artery, and the internal carotid in the cerebral part also gives off one more branch, which is known as anterior choroidal artery, which hasn't been shown in this model. Now we'll be discussing the circle of Willis. So rotating it to the let me reorient you to this model. So this is the right side, this is the posterior part, this is the left side which has been removed, and now I'll rotate to the underside of the brain. So this is the pons, this is the medulla oblongata, and above the pons is the midbrain, which you can't see clearly. It will be visible once I zoom in. These were the two vertebral arteries which join to form the basilar artery. Now the basilar artery is giving off two branches. The one which is inferior is the superior cerebellar artery, and the one which is superior to it is the posterior cerebral artery. Now the circle of Willis is formed by the posterior cerebral artery, but not by the superior cerebellar artery. So this here is the posterior cerebral artery, and we told that there is one artery connecting the posterior cerebral artery to this structure over here, which is the internal carotid. So this is the posterior communicating artery. This is the posterior communicating artery, this is the internal carotid artery. Again, this is the posterior cerebral, this is the posterior communicating artery, and this here is the anterior communicating artery. And now we can see another artery arising from the internal carotid, which is the anterior cerebral artery. So these here are the anterior cerebral arteries, and the two anterior cerebral arteries are connected by the anterior communicating artery. So this is our circle of Willis being formed by the two posterior cerebral arteries, the internal carotid system, the posterior communicating artery, the internal carotid artery, the anterior cerebral arteries, the another anterior cerebral artery, and the anterior communicating artery. So this finishes our video on the arterial supply to the brain and circle of Willis.